The last thing colony ship Mayflower's Promise ever broadcast was 11 seconds of audio. No distress call, no coordinates, no Mayday in any of the 17 languages humanity uses when it is terrified and needs help. Just 11 seconds of open channel, the sound of people who had no time left for words. Then silence. The ship carried 4,200 colonists, families mostly. The kind of people who sign up for a 14-month transit to a new world because they believe in something, in starting over, in the frontier, in the particular American idea that somewhere out there is a place worth the risk of getting there. Engineers and farmers and teachers and kids who had never seen anything outside of Earth's orbit, pressed against the viewport windows as the Mayflower's Promise crossed into the Tereth Corridor. The corridor is the fastest route between Earth's established colonies and the outer expansion zone. A narrow band of navigable space bracketed on both sides by dense stellar nurseries that no ship can safely transit. Every colonist ship uses it. Every cargo hauler, every diplomatic vessel. For 11 years, it has been the artery of humanity's expansion into the deeper galaxy. The Zikari closed it 4 months ago, not with a declaration, not with a warning buoy or a formal notification through any of the 17 interstellar diplomatic channels humanity monitors. They closed it the way you close a fist. Suddenly, completely, without explanation. 3 ships in the first week, 7 in the second. The Mayflower's Promise was the 22nd vessel to enter the corridor and not come out the other side. 4,200 people, no wreckage recovered. No bodies, no debris field, no emergency beacon, no black box signal. Just the corridor. Open, navigable, silent. And somewhere inside it, the Zikari, who have still not explained themselves, have still not responded to any communication, have still not done anything except continue to intercept and destroy every human vessel that enters their self-declared exclusion zone. The United Earth Defense Command met for 16 hours after the Mayflower's Promise disappeared. At the end of those 16 hours, they made 2 decisions. The first decision was to formally designate the Zikari as a hostile power. The second decision was to call Admiral Elena Vasquez. She was not hard to find. She was at her desk at UEDC headquarters in Colorado Springs, where she had been for the past 11 days, not sleeping much, running simulations on 3 screens simultaneously, waiting for someone to make a decision she had already made for herself 3 weeks ago. When the call came through, she picked up on the first ring. The UEDC director, General Marcus Webb, a man who had been in military command for 30 years and had the careful voice of someone who measures every word, said, "Admiral, the Council has authorized military action in the Tereth Corridor. You have full operational command." Elena Vasquez was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "How many ships?" she asked. "Everything," Webb said. "Whatever you need." Another pause, shorter this time. "Get me the 7th Fleet," she said. "And the 3rd. And the Experimental Division." A beat. "And General Webb, I want the Meridian pulled from reserve." Webb was quiet for a moment. The Meridian was the largest warship ever constructed by human hands. It had never been deployed in active combat. It was, in certain defense circles, considered almost too powerful to use. A deterrent. A symbol. The kind of asset you hold back to remind other powers what you're capable of. "The Meridian," Webb repeated carefully. "Yes," Vasquez said. "Because I want the Zikari to see it coming. I want them to have time to think about it. And I want the last thing they think, before they understand what they have made the mistake of starting, to be the Meridian." Webb was quiet for another moment. "Understood," he said. "Godspeed, Admiral." Elena Vasquez hung up the phone. She turned to her screens, 3 of them covered in simulations, in tactical overlays, in everything she had spent 11 days preparing for this exact moment. She looked at the Tereth Corridor on the center screen. 22 ships, she said quietly to herself, to the map, to the 4,200 people who no longer had voices. 22 ships and 4 months of silence. She reached for her jacket. Not anymore. Before she was Admiral Vasquez, she was Lieutenant Commander Vasquez, and before that she was Captain Vasquez of the destroyer USS Sacramento, and before that she was a 23-year-old ensign from San Antonio, Texas, who had enlisted because her older brother had enlisted, and her older brother had enlisted because their father had, and the Vasquez family had been sending its children into uniform for 4 generations, with the same combination of duty and stubbornness that runs through certain families like a current through wire. The thing that made Elena Vasquez different from other officers, the thing that her subordinates noticed within the first week of serving under her, the thing that made some of them deeply uncomfortable and others fiercely loyal, was that she counted. Not in the abstract the way commanders count, as in casualties and acceptable losses and force ratios. She counted specifically. Names, faces, the particular human weight of individual people. After the Sacramento's first combat engagement, a skirmish with a pirate syndicate in the Helios Belt that lasted 4 minutes and cost the lives of 3 crew members, Vasquez had spent the night writing letters. Not form letters, not the standard UEDC notification templates. 3 separate letters, each one different, each one containing something specific and true about the person it was written for. She had known all 3 crew members for 9 months. She wrote what she actually knew. Her XO at the time had suggested, gently, that this was not scalable practice for a military career. Vasquez had looked at him and said, "I know, I'm going to make sure it doesn't need to scale." What she meant, what became clear over the next 20 years, was that she intended to fight wars in ways that made mass casualty lists shorter on her side. She was not a pacifist. She was not naive about what combat required. She was, by every metric, one of the most tactically aggressive flag officers in UEDC history, with a record of engagements that consistently achieved objectives at lower cost than projected. But behind every tactical decision was the same driver: the names, the faces, the specific, particular, irreducible weight of individual human beings. When the Mayflower's promise disappeared, Elena Vasquez had pulled the passenger manifest within 2 hours of the loss report. All 4,200 names. She had not read them all. There was not time for that. But she had opened the file, scrolled through it slowly, and looked at it as a thing that represented people rather than a number that represented an event. Then she had started planning. The plan she arrived at over 11 days of simulation was not what the UEDC tactical staff expected. Most of them, running their own models, had arrived at the same basic framework. A combat fleet entering the corridor, engaging Zicari forces, attempting to establish a contested safe passage. Vasquez's plan was different. She was not going to contest the corridor. She was going to end the Zicari's capacity to ever contest anything again. The distinction mattered enormously. Contesting the corridor meant a sustained campaign, months of engagement, grinding through Zicari defensive positions, taking losses, establishing supply lines, fighting for every kilometer of navigable space while the Zicari retreated, regrouped, and adapted. It was the kind of war that military planners called attritional and that lasted years and cost thousands of lives and ended with negotiated settlements that left the underlying problem partially intact. Vasquez had read enough history to know what she thought about attritional wars. She had built instead a plan that operated on a different principle entirely. Not attrition, not grinding. The principle she had chosen was surgical, total, and deliberately overwhelming. A force so comprehensively superior that it left the Zicari with no decision to make except whether to surrender immediately or be removed from the equation completely. The principle had a name in military theory. It was called shock and cessation. Shock the enemy so completely, so instantaneously, so absolutely, that their capacity for organized resistance ceases before it can be employed. She had one problem with the plan. She needed the Meridian. The UESS Meridian is not a warship in the conventional sense. The way a bulldozer is not a shovel in the conventional sense. It is 4 kilometers long. Its main drive alone displaces more energy than the entire Helios Belt mining operation. Its armament, which took 11 years to develop and 3 years to install, includes weapon systems that were classified at the highest level of UEDC security clearance, systems that the defense contractors who built them called, among themselves and not in any official documentation, planet argument weapons. Not planet killers. Planet argument weapons. The kind of armament you bring to a disagreement when you want the disagreement to resolve itself very quickly in your favor. It had been in reserve for 6 years. Its crew of 3,000 had run drills, run simulations, run every preparation exercise the UEDC had designed for them. They had never fired a shot in anger. When Vasquez's activation order came through, the Meridian's commanding officer, Captain James Okafor, a 47-year-old veteran of 3 frontier conflicts who had spent 6 years waiting for exactly this moment, read it twice, called his crew to battle stations, and said into the ship-wide intercom, "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been called up. Admiral Vasquez is taking us to the Tareth corridor. I want every system at 100%. I want 0 squawks. I want this ship to be exactly what it was built to be." He paused. Those colonists deserve nothing less. The fleet assembled at Waypoint Kestrel, a deep space staging area 3 light hours from the corridor entrance, over the course of 48 hours. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary thing to witness. The 7th Fleet arrived first. 43 destroyers and frigates in tight formation, sleek and fast and configured for rapid engagement. Then the 3rd Fleet, 28 heavier cruisers, bristling with long-range ordnance, the kind of ships that establish fire superiority before a battle begins. The Experimental Division, 8 vessels that did not fit any conventional category, each one built around a weapons concept that had never been tested outside of controlled environments. And finally, arriving last as Vasquez had planned, moving through the assembled fleet like something geological, like a feature of landscape rather than a constructed object, the Meridian. The reaction among the assembled fleet crews was recorded in dozens of personal logs and after-action reports. Common words: enormous, impossible, actually impossible. One ensign aboard a 3rd Fleet cruiser wrote in her log, "We've trained with the Meridian on simulations for 2 years. The simulation does not prepare you for the actual thing. When it came through the formation, it blocked out the stars. 4 kilometers of warship. I understood for the first time why they built it." Admiral Vasquez stood on the bridge of her flagship, the UESS Resolution, and watched the fleet complete its assembly on her tactical display. 79 ships, plus the Meridian, plus 3,000 crew on the Meridian alone, and 42,000 across the full fleet. Plus the most sophisticated weapons technology humanity had ever committed to a single engagement. She thought about the Mayflower's promise, about the 11 seconds of open channel, about the passenger manifest. "All ships, Admiral Vasquez," she said into the fleet-wide channel. "In 20 minutes we enter the Tareth corridor. What happened to our people in that corridor happened because someone decided we were prey. We are going to correct that assessment, permanently." She paused. "All station chiefs, confirm readiness." 80 confirmation signals came back in the next 40 seconds. "Good," she said. She turned to her helmsman. "Take us in." The Zikari had not always been conquerors. There is a file in the UEDC intelligence archives, compiled over 9 years of contact, observation, and increasingly tense diplomatic exchange, that attempts to explain what the Zikari are and how they became what they are. It is a thorough document. It is read carefully by every senior UEDC officer. Elena Vasquez had read it 4 times and had annotated it extensively with a red pen, which is how she reads documents she considers important. The most important annotation she made was on page 1. Page 1 of the Zikari intelligence file contains a single paragraph summarizing the species. The Zikari are an expansionist military culture estimated to have achieved interstellar capability approximately 300 years before humanity. They have absorbed or destroyed 11 known civilizations within their territorial expansion zone and show no diplomatic history of negotiated boundary resolution. Their operational doctrine is built on the principle of total information dominance. The Zikari never engage an enemy they have not fully mapped, never attack a position they have not surveilled, and never commit forces without an overwhelming advantage in situational awareness. Vasquez's annotation in red pen next to this paragraph. They have never fought us. What the annotation meant, what it pointed to, in the precise tactical mind of a woman who had spent 30 years thinking about how to fight and win, was a gap. A specific, exploitable gap between what the Zikari knew how to do and what they had actually encountered. The Zikari system of total information dominance was extraordinary. Their sensor networks were the most sophisticated UEDC intelligence had ever analyzed, layered, redundant, capable of detecting a ship's drive signature from 3 light hours away and calculating its vector, speed, and weapons configuration before it came within engagement range. They knew, at any given moment, exactly what they were dealing with. This had worked perfectly against 11 other civilizations. The problem, the specific lethal problem that Vasquez had identified on day 3 of her 11 days of simulation, was that their doctrine was built around the information they could receive. It was not built for information they had never seen. The Zikari had detailed files on human military technology. UEDC intelligence had confirmed this. The Zikari had been gathering data on human military assets since first contact 9 years ago. Their files on human destroyers, cruisers, and standard frigate configurations were almost certainly more accurate than UEDC's own maintenance records. They knew human weapons ranges, human fleet tactics, human response times. They had built a complete model of how a human military engagement worked. Their model did not include the Meridian, because the Meridian had never been deployed. No sensor data existed for it. No drive signature had ever been recorded outside of controlled UEDC testing environments. No weapons discharge had ever been measured. The Meridian was, from the perspective of every piece of intelligence the Zikari possessed, a theoretical, a rumor, a footnote in a report that read, "Humans are allegedly constructing a vessel of unusual scale, purpose unknown." Vasquez's entire plan hinged on this gap. She needed the Zikari to see the fleet coming. Their sensor networks would detect it instantly, from the moment it entered the corridor. She needed them to process it through their doctrine, calculate their response, commit their forces to a position. She needed them, in other words, to be exactly as smart and well-prepared as they were, and then she needed to show them something their doctrine had no category for. The Zikari Corridor Defense Commander was named Varek Sul. He was by any measure one of the finest military minds in Zikari history. 200 years old, a veteran of 4 expansion campaigns, the architect of the intercept doctrine that had stopped 22 human vessels in the past 4 months. He had reviewed every piece of data on human military capability available to the Zikari intelligence apparatus, and had designed his corridor defense accordingly. When his sensor network detected the human fleet entering the corridor, he was not surprised. He had expected retaliation. The humans had taken losses. They would respond with force. This was predictable. He reviewed the incoming sensor data with methodical calm. 79 ships. He could identify every class, every configuration, every likely weapons loadout. His models projected their engagement parameters within 3% accuracy. He began positioning his own forces. 240 Zikari warships, arrayed in the layered defensive formation that had not failed in 3 centuries of expansion campaigns. Then his sensor operator said something unexpected. "Commander, there is a contact I cannot identify." Varek Sul turned. "Clarify." "It is behind the human formation, it is—" The operator paused, running recalibrations. "Commander, I'm showing a contact 4 kilometers in length. Mass signature consistent with a small moon. Drive output is—" Another pause. "I don't have a reference frame for this drive output, sir. My models don't have this in their parameters." Varek Sul moved to the sensor station. He looked at the contact. He had not survived 200 years of warfare by panicking. He looked at the data carefully, dispassionately, with the methodical precision that had made him exceptional. After 30 seconds, he said, very quietly, "What is that?" No one on the bridge answered, because no one knew. Admiral Vasquez had given the Meridian one instruction before the fleet entered the corridor. "Stay behind the formation until I call you," she told Captain Okafor. "Let them see you. Let them look at you. Let them spend every second trying to figure out what you are and what you can do. I want them distracted before we engage." Okafor had understood immediately. "How long do you want me to hold back?" Vasquez had thought about it. "Until the moment they think they're winning," she said. The Battle of the Tarith Corridor began at 0347 ship time on a Tuesday, which is not the dramatic timestamp military historians usually prefer, but accuracy matters. The first phase was what military doctrine called a probe and fix. The 7th Fleet's 43 destroyers moving ahead in a fast, spread formation, pushing into the corridor at maximum speed, drawing the Zikari defense into commitment. The Zikari responded exactly as Vasquez's models predicted. Their outer picket line activated, 24 fast attack craft moving to intercept, their firing solutions clean and their confidence absolute. The destroyers took hits. That was expected. That was, in the cold arithmetic of Vasquez's plan, necessary, not because she was willing to spend her people freely, but because a battle that looked too easy, too one-sided, would prompt Varric Sul to hold his forces back rather than commit. She needed him to engage. She needed him to believe this was the fight he had planned for. On the bridge of the Resolution, Vasquez watched the engagement telemetry with focused stillness. Her staff moved around her, officers calling out data, updating displays, managing the 1,000 simultaneous processes of a fleet engagement. She stood at the center of it still, watching the specific thing she was watching for. The moment Varric Sul committed his reserves, it came 18 minutes into the engagement. The Zykari second wave, 160 warships, their main battle force, began moving forward to exploit what their models told them was an emerging advantage. The human destroyers were taking pressure. The formation was beginning to flex. In the Zykari tactical picture, this looked like the moment to push through and shatter the human line before their heavier ships could compensate. This was correct by every conventional metric, which was exactly why Vasquez had made sure her heavier ships were not in the position her fleet's formation suggested. "Third Fleet," she said into her command channel. "Now." The 28 heavy cruisers of the Third Fleet had not been where the Zykari's sensor map placed them. They had been running silent, tucked into the electromagnetic shadow of a dense stellar dust cloud that occupied a section of the corridor the Zykari's models had assessed as non-navigable. It was navigable. Just barely. Vasquez had spent 6 of her 11 days working that out. The cruisers emerged from the dust cloud directly on the flank of Varric Sul's committed second wave. 28 heavy cruisers at knife range with full weapons hot. The Zykari formation fractured. Not collapsed. The Zykari were too disciplined for instant collapse. But fractured, individual captains suddenly processing a threat that had appeared where their doctrine said no threat could be. Their perfectly arrayed formation suddenly interrupted by the brutal physics of 28 ships opening fire from 90 degrees off their expected axis. On the Zykari command vessel Varric Sul, a ship named for its commander, which is a Zykari tradition that Vasquez had always found interesting, the commander himself was recalculating. He was good at recalculating. He had done it before. His second wave was fractured but not destroyed. He still had his reserve. 80 ships, held back at his rear position, not yet committed. He still had numerical advantage. He could reconsolidate. He began issuing orders. He got 6 of them out before his sensor operator made another report. "Commander, the unknown contact is moving." The Meridian came forward. There is a physics principle called displacement, and it applies to large objects moving through any medium. The very mass of the thing changes what is around it. The Meridian moving at combat speed through the corridor did not announce itself with weapons fire. It announced itself by existing. A 4-kilometer wall of human engineering, its running lights off, its hull absorbing radar in ways that the UEDC's classified materials team had spent 4 years perfecting. Visible not on sensors but in the most ancient way. The light of the corridor's background stars simply stopped, blocked by a thing so large it was its own horizon. Varric Sul saw it on visual display. He had been in warfare for 150 years. He felt something he could not immediately name. It took him 3 seconds to name it. The feeling was scale. He had never, in 150 years of combat, encountered something that made him feel the specific wrongness of scale. The sensation of looking at something and understanding that your categories are insufficient, that you have walked outside the edges of your model of the world, that the thing you are looking at does not fit inside the frameworks you have built, because it was built by something that thinks differently than you, that has a different relationship to the question of how large should a weapon be. His reserve commander was calling for orders. Varric Sul looked at the Meridian. His reserve commander called again. "Commander, orders?" Varric Sul's doctrine, the doctrine that had never failed in 3 centuries, the doctrine built on total information dominance and overwhelming situational advantage, had no classification for what he was looking at. His doctrine assumed you knew what you were facing. You gathered intelligence, you built your model. You fought within the parameters your model defined. He did not have a model for the Meridian. "All ships," he said slowly. "Defensive reform. Pull back to secondary positions. It was the right tactical decision. It was also the last good decision the Zicari corridor defense made, because Vasquez had planned for it. The experimental division, 8 ships, each one a weapons concept that had never been field tested, activated on Vasquez's command the moment the Zicari began their pullback. The pullback was the most vulnerable moment in any engagement, the point where a force is moving, reorganizing, not yet settled into a new position. Varexul knew this. He was moving fast, trying to minimize the exposure window. He needed 40 seconds to reach his secondary positions. The experimental division gave him 12. The weapons concepts the experimental ships carried were classified, and the full technical details are still, as of this account, restricted under UEDC security protocols. What can be said is this. 2 of the 8 ships carried directed energy systems capable of sustained fire across distances that conventional military doctrine considered outside engagement range. 3 carried a new class of self-guided ordnance that did not function on the electromagnetic tracking systems Zicari countermeasures were designed to defeat. The remaining 3 carried something that the development team had called, in their project proposal documentation, a formation disruptor, a weapons system designed not to destroy individual ships, but to interfere with the FTL communications network that coordinated fleet formation. A fleet that cannot communicate in formation is not a fleet. It is 240 individual ships, each making its own decision, each unable to coordinate with its neighbors, in the middle of a combat environment designed by someone who had spent 30 years thinking about exactly this problem. Vasquez called the Meridian forward. What happened in the next 14 minutes in the Tereth corridor has been analyzed and reanalyzed in every major military academy on Earth and its colonies for the years since. It is taught as a case study in asymmetric force application. It is described in the popular press as a battle. It is described in those military academy classrooms as something else. The word the instructors use is deconstruction. The Meridian's primary weapon systems firing for the first time in combat were not subtle. They were not elegant. They were precisely, purely, overwhelmingly effective in the way that only something built with almost unlimited resources and no compromises can be effective. Each discharge covered a volume of space that, in conventional naval engagements, would contain an entire fleet. Each discharge was targeted by a fire control system that had been in continuous development for 6 years and tested against simulations of every known weapons configuration in human space. The Zicari had never been in a simulation. By minute 4 of the Meridian's engagement, Varexul's reserve fleet, the 80 ships he had held back, the force he had planned to use to reform his defense, was no longer a coherent military unit. By minute 9, the Zicari corridor defense had lost contact with more than half its command nodes. By minute 14, Varexul transmitted the signal that no Zicari commander had ever transmitted in 3 centuries of expansion. The signal was their emergency evacuation code. The battle was over in 22 minutes. Total human fleet losses: 9 ships. 41 crew members killed in action. Every loss catalogued. Every name recorded. Total Zicari corridor defense effectively ceased to exist as a military formation. Admiral Vasquez received the cessation of combat report on the bridge of the Resolution. She stood very still for a moment. Then she walked to her tactical display, which showed the corridor, open, navigable, no longer contested, and the scatter of Zicari emergency signals from vessels attempting to withdraw. She made a decision. All ships hold fire on withdrawing vessels, she said into the fleet channel. Let them go. Her weapons officer turned. Admiral, if we pursue... I know what we can do, Vasquez said quietly. We're not going to do it. Let them go. A pause. They'll report back, the weapons officer said. They'll tell their command structure what happened here. Yes, Vasquez said, they will. She turned back to the display. That's the point. The survivors of the Tereth corridor battle reached Zicari command territory in 31 hours. There were 47 of them. 47 ships out of 240, each one carrying the same story, the same sensor logs, the same 22 minutes of recorded reality that no amount of tactical experience or cultural certainty could adequately explain. The Zicari Supreme Military Council convened an emergency session. They watched the sensor logs. They watched them again. They asked their analysts to look for errors, for anomalies, for evidence that the data had been corrupted or manipulated. The analysts looked. There were no errors. There were no anomalies. The data was clean. What it showed was this. A human fleet had entered the Tereth corridor. A human fleet that included a vessel with no classification in any Zykari intelligence file, no reference in any tactical database, no precedent in any engagement record. A vessel 4 kilometers long that had fired weapons the Zykari had no countermeasure for, because the Zykari's countermeasures were designed for weapons they knew existed. One of the council members, an elder commander named Garish Val, 800 years old, the longest-serving member of the military leadership, asked a question that was recorded in the session transcript and later became something close to a historical turning point. "How long have they had this?" she asked. Her intelligence chief checked his records. "The Meridian-class program began construction 7 years ago," he said. "We had a notation. We assessed it as a prestige project, a symbol of capability, not intended for combat deployment." Garish Val was quiet for a moment. "We assessed incorrectly," she said. "Yes, Commander." "What else?" she said slowly. "Have we assessed incorrectly about them?" The intelligence chief was quiet for a longer moment. "That," he admitted, "is a question I do not have a complete answer to." 3 days after the battle, Admiral Vasquez received a transmission. It was from the Zykari Supreme Military Council. It was addressed to her specifically by name, which was unusual. The Zykari did not typically acknowledge individual human commanders in diplomatic communication. They addressed humanity collectively, as a species, the way you address a territory rather than a people. This transmission was different. It requested a meeting. Vasquez read it twice. Then she called her flag captain, Commander Sofia Reyes, a 38-year-old officer from El Paso, Texas, who had been Vasquez's right hand for 6 years, and who had a gift for reading the subtext of communications that Vasquez genuinely relied on. "Read this," Vasquez said. Reyes read it. "They're scared," Reyes said. "I know. This is the first time they've asked to talk instead of demanding." "I know. Are you going to meet with them?" Vasquez looked at the transmission again, at the language, formal, careful, stripped of the condescension that had characterized every Zykari communication with humanity for 9 years. Something had changed in it. Not just the words, the tone, the weight. "Yes," she said, "but not yet." Reyes waited. "First," Vasquez said, "I want to open the corridor." The Tereth corridor reopened for civilian traffic 5 days after the battle. The first ship through was a resupply vessel, the SS Eleanor, carrying medical equipment and agricultural seed stock for the outer colonies that had been cut off for 4 months. It was not a dramatic ship. It was a cargo hauler, 40 years old, crewed by 11 people who had been waiting on the wrong side of a closed door for months. The captain of the Eleanor, a 52-year-old woman from Phoenix named Maria Santos, brought her ship through the corridor at standard transit speed, without incident, under the watchful sensors of the human fleet that remained on station at both ends. She did not know until afterward that Admiral Vasquez had personally flagged the Eleanor's transit and watched it on her tactical display from start to finish. When the Eleanor cleared the far end of the corridor and Santos sent her arrival signal, Vasquez was notified. She stood at her display for a moment. Then she did something her staff had never seen her do in 6 years of service. She smiled, not the controlled, professional acknowledgement expression her crew was accustomed to. Something else. Something that had nothing to do with tactics or command decisions. Her weapons officer, Lieutenant Chen, no relation to anyone in this history, a 26-year-old from Chicago who had been aboard the Resolution for 8 months and was still figuring out how to read Vasquez, noticed it and wrote about it later. "I have served under Admiral Vasquez for 8 months," he wrote. "She is an extraordinary officer. She is also a difficult person to know. She keeps things close. She doesn't perform her feelings for her crew. But when the Eleanor's arrival signal came in, I watched her face and what I saw was relief. Not the relief of winning a battle. Something more personal than that. Like she had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had just been told she could put it down. I think she was thinking about the Mayflower's promise. I think she's always thinking about the Mayflower's promise." The meeting with the Zykari delegation took place 12 days after the battle, aboard a neutral station in unclaimed space. Vasquez brought a staff of 6. The Zikari delegation numbered 40, which told Vasquez something about how they viewed the meeting. It was a large delegation for a species that usually communicated through minimal representatives. They wanted bodies in the room. They wanted weight. She let them have the table arrangement they wanted. She let them have the formal opening protocols they preferred. She sat across from the Zikari delegation chief, a senior diplomat named Corveth Ann, composed and careful, giving away nothing, and she was patient. The opening statements took 2 hours. The Zikari had a great deal of carefully worded language about territorial boundaries and navigational rights and mutual interest in stability. Vasquez let all of it wash through her. Her staff took notes. She watched Corveth Ann. When the opening statements concluded, there was a pause. Into that pause, Vasquez said, "I'd like to speak plainly, if that's acceptable." Corveth Ann's composure shifted slightly, a fraction. "Proceed." "We're not here to negotiate territorial boundaries," Vasquez said. "You know that, and I know that. You closed the corridor. You destroyed 22 civilian vessels carrying 4,200 people. You did not explain why. You did not respond to any of 17 diplomatic channels, and you did not stop when we asked you to stop." She looked directly at Corveth Ann. "So I stopped you myself." Silence. "The question on the table," Vasquez continued, "is simple. Is this over, or do we need to have a different conversation?" She paused. "By different conversation, I want to be precise. I mean, I take the 7th Fleet, the 3rd Fleet, the Experimental Division, and the Meridian, and we have the kind of conversation that doesn't end with a negotiated settlement." Corveth Ann was very still. "You are describing the elimination of the Zikari military capability," she said carefully. "I'm describing the logical extension of a conflict that your side started without explanation, and ours finished in 22 minutes, Vasquez said. "I would prefer not to have that conversation. I have 41 names on a casualty list from the corridor battle, and I would prefer the list to stop there. But that preference has conditions." "What conditions?" Vasquez put a document on the table. "Full accounting," she said. "What happened to our 22 ships? Survivor status, if any. Recovery of remains, if any. An explanation for why the corridor was closed. Formal agreement that it remains open for civilian traffic permanently, guaranteed by a joint monitoring framework that has teeth." She looked at the document. "And a formal acknowledgement on record that this is the settlement. That we're done. That there is no next escalation." Corveth Ann looked at the document. "And if we decline these conditions?" Vasquez picked up the document and put it back in her folder. "Then I go back to my ship," she said, "and we have the other conversation." The room was very quiet. The Zikari delegation requested a recess. The recess lasted 4 hours. When they returned, Corveth Ann sat down and placed her own document on the table. It was longer than Vasquez's. It contained things that Vasquez's intelligence staff had not known. Details about the 4-month corridor campaign. About decisions made at levels of Zikari command that the survivors of the battle had not been aware of. It also contained survivor status for 3 of the 22 ships. Not all of them. Not most of them. 3. Vasquez read that section of the document. Her face did not change, but Commander Reyes, seated to her right, noted afterward that Vasquez's hand tightened once on the table edge and then relaxed. "We accept the conditions," Corveth Ann said. Vasquez looked up from the document. "All of them?" she asked. "All of them." Vasquez nodded once. "Then we're done here," she said. She did not say it with triumph. She did not perform the victory. She said it the way a person says something true, plainly, completely, with the weight of everything it cost behind it. The first thing Admiral Elena Vasquez did when she returned to the Resolution after the negotiation was concluded was go to her office and close the door. Her staff, who had served with her for years, understood that this meant she needed 20 minutes. What she did in those 20 minutes no one knew with certainty. But her yeoman, a young petty officer from Seattle named Torres, who handled Vasquez's administrative work and had a gift for quiet observation, noted that the Admiral came out of her office 20 minutes later carrying a legal pad covered in notes, and that when he saw the legal pad as she set it on her desk, it appeared to contain a list of names. Not orders, not tactical assessments, names. He did not ask about it. He had served under Vasquez long enough to know better. What the list contained, what was confirmed later in the biographical material that Vasquez reviewed before she permitted its use, were the names of the 3 ships whose survivors the Zicari had identified. 47 people. Out of 4,200, 47 people had been taken alive from the wreckage of intercepted civilian ships and placed in a Zicari detention facility, pending the outcome of the Corridor campaign. 47 people who were alive. Vasquez spent those 20 minutes doing the math. 4,153. She did not look away from the number. She did not round it. She held it precisely, specifically, as a thing made of individual people. Then she wrote down the 47 names. The first call she made after leaving her office was not to UEDC headquarters or to the fleet commanders or to the diplomatic team coordinating the Zicari agreement's implementation. It was to the rescue coordination team. She wanted to know timelines. She wanted to know how fast they could get a ship to the Zicari detention facility. She wanted to know, specifically, what 47 people who had been in alien detention for up to 4 months would need when they came home, and whether the Resolution's medical bay was configured to handle it. Her chief medical officer told her the medical bay was not fully configured for that kind of intake. Then reconfigure it, Vasquez said. Today. The rescue ship UESS Providence reached the Zicari detention facility 8 days after the negotiation concluded. It carried 3 doctors, 2 mental health specialists, a translator fluent in Zicari communicative protocols, and enough supplies for 100 people because Vasquez had specified margin. The 47 survivors came aboard over the course of 6 hours. They were in varying states of health. Some walked off under their own power. Some were carried. 2 were in critical condition that the Providence's medical team stabilized during the return transit. All 47 made it home. On the day the Providence docked at Waypoint Kestrel, which was now the operational headquarters for what the UEDC was calling the Corridor Restoration Mission, Admiral Vasquez was there. Not in full ceremonial dress, not with a formal receiving line or a press event or any of the apparatus of military homecoming ceremonies. She was standing on the docking level in her working uniform, which is what she always wore, with Commander Reyes at her side watching the airlock. When the first survivors came through, the docking level was quiet. No ceremony, no announcement. Vasquez had specifically requested no announcement. A woman came through the airlock, one of the civilian survivors, a teacher from the Mayflower's Promise named Sandra Park, 41 years old, from Portland, Oregon, and stopped when she saw Vasquez. Park had been in alien detention for 4 months. She was thin, slightly unsteady, wearing borrowed clothes from the Providence's supply locker. She looked at the Admiral standing 20 feet away in a working uniform with no entourage, no ceremony, no performance. "You came," Park said. Vasquez crossed the 20 feet. "Of course," she said. There is no official record of what was said in the next few minutes. Vasquez did not include it in any after-action report. Commander Reyes, who was present, said afterward only that it was private and that it should remain private. What the docking level logs do show is that the debarkation of 47 survivors took 4 hours, and that Admiral Elena Vasquez was present for all 4 hours, and that she spoke personally to each of the 47 people who came through that airlock. Every single one. The Tarith Corridor Agreement was formally ratified 6 weeks after the battle. It established permanent civilian navigation rights through the corridor, a joint monitoring station crewed by both human and Zicari personnel, and a dispute resolution framework that required communication before any exclusion zone could be declared. It was, by any historical measure, a complete and comprehensive victory for humanity. The Zicari military had been neutralized as a threat to human expansion. The corridor was open. The survivors were home. The 41 crew members killed in the battle were being honored with full military ceremony, and their families received personal communications from Admiral Vasquez, not form letters, not templates. 41 letters, each one different, each one containing something specific and true about the person it was written for. At the formal ceremony marking the corridor's reopening, Vasquez was called on to speak. She did not give the speech that had been drafted for her by the UEDC Communications Office, which was a fine speech, full of the right phrases about sacrifice and victory and the enduring strength of humanity's resolve. She gave a different speech. It was short. Vasquez's speeches were always short. 4,200 people entered this corridor 4 months ago, she said. They were teachers and engineers and farmers and kids. They were going somewhere. They deserve to get there. She paused. 47 of them are going to get there eventually. The rest, we carry them, that's what this is for. She looked out at the fleet assembled behind her. 79 ships plus the Meridian, which had come to the ceremony at her specific request, because she wanted it visible, because she wanted the message visible. We did not come here for conquest, she said. We are not the Zikari. We don't close corridors without explanation. We don't destroy ships without warning. We extend the hand first, and we extend it sincerely, and we keep extending it until there is no other option. She paused. And when there is no other option, we show up, with everything we have, and we do not leave until every one of our people is accounted for. She looked at the sensor display to her left. The corridor, open, clean, with a small civilian cargo ship already in transit at the far end. The corridor is open, she said. Go where you're going. In the years after the battle, the Tereth corridor became something it had never been before. Not just a navigational route, but a symbol. The kind of place that gets a name in the cultural memory of a species. The place where the line was drawn, where the accounting happened, where humanity demonstrated something about itself that it would carry forward. What it demonstrated was debated, analyzed, written about, argued over in classrooms and editorial columns in military academies and dinner tables. Some said it demonstrated humanity's military capability. Obviously true. Some said it demonstrated humanity's strategic superiority. Arguably true. Some said it demonstrated something harder to quantify, a particular quality that showed up in the battle plan and showed up in the negotiation, and showed up on the docking level, when a woman in a working uniform stood for 4 hours making sure every survivor knew someone had come for them. The quality did not have a clean military term. The closest anyone ever got was something Vasquez herself said in an interview 2 years after the battle, when a journalist asked her what she thought the corridor engagement had proven about humanity. She had thought about it for a moment. We don't stop counting, she said. Other species, when they take casualties, they count casualties. They see a number. We see the number too, but we also see the people inside the number. Every single one. We count them by name. She paused. That changes how you fight. It changes what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do and how hard you work to make the list shorter. And it changes what victory actually means. The journalist asked, "What does victory mean?" Vasquez thought about that too. 47 people walking off a ship, she said. That's what it means. The rest of it, the battle, the fleet, the treaty, that's all in service of that moment. 47 people walking home. She was quiet for a second. I'd have preferred 4,200, she said. I'll carry the difference for the rest of my life. Then she looked at the journalist and said, with the particular quiet certainty of a woman who has already decided her next move, but we kept the corridor open, and we'll keep it open, and the next ship through will get where it's going. That's the job. The UESS Meridian remained on station at the corridor for 6 months after the battle, as part of the joint monitoring framework agreed in the Tereth Accord. 6 months of presence, visible on every sensor in the region, a statement that required no translation. Then it returned to its home port. But it did not return to reserve. Admiral Vasquez had made sure of that. The Meridian was reclassified from strategic reserve to active deployment. Its crew stayed aboard, stayed trained, stayed ready. Because the Zikari were not the only power watching what happened in the Tereth corridor. The galaxy has a lot of corridors, a lot of routes, a lot of species who had looked at humanity for a long time and made their own assessments. Those assessments were being revised. Somewhere in a council chamber or a command post or a strategic planning room, someone who had spent years believing humanity was manageable was looking at 22 minutes of sensor data and asking their intelligence staff for a full review. Good, Vasquez thought when UEDC intelligence briefed her on the ripple effects. Let them look. Let them understand that what they were looking at was not an anomaly, not a lucky engagement, not a one-time escalation. What they were looking at was a species that counted its dead by name, that built 4-kilometer warships and kept them in reserve until the moment they were needed, that sent its admiral to stand in a docking bay for 4 hours, making sure every survivor knew they had not been forgotten. That was not a species you wanted to make an enemy of. That was a species you wanted to make a deal with quickly, before the deal was no longer your idea. The Meridian kept its engines warm. Admiral Vasquez kept her list, and the Tarath corridor stayed open.